Why do you feel pity for Russian soldiers? These are people who voluntarily invade their neighboring country and commit the worst war crimes against what they call their brother nation. Because I'm human, and because it disgusts me that people sitting behind their computers get off on watching people being torn apart and make funny memes about it. I'm well aware that a Russian soldier who volunteers today knows exactly what he's getting into. He knows that he is carrying out an invasion of a neighboring country. He might not know that war crimes are being committed there, but he'll find out soon enough, and in theory, he always has the option to act on that knowledge. I'm fully aware of that. But they are and remain human beings. And that's why I also feel compassion for the civilians in the Gaza Strip, even though I know that 95% of them cheered when Jews were slaughtered. And when the hostages were brought into the Gaza Strip, the civilians attacked the hostages so much that Hamas had to protect the hostages from the civilians in Gaza. There were Nazis, even with party badges, who protected Jews during the Holocaust. There were Germans who protected Jews, of course. But there wasn't a single person in the Gaza Strip who helped the Israeli hostages. Not a single one. Still, I feel compassion for them because they are human beings. And I can't take pleasure in it. I can't turn off the fact that they are my fellow human beings, and that's what they are. I acknowledge the guilt, I acknowledge the responsibility, and I grant the Ukrainians every right to defeat the invasion, to fight the invaders. That goes without saying. Anyone who invades Ukraine is a legitimate target. They may not only be taken prisoner, but may also be wounded and killed. But they are and remain human beings. And then there's another point. Look, why do I run this channel? Why am I able to talk about the things I talk about? Why can we discuss AEW aircraft? Why can we talk about AESA radar, where I may not always be able to explain to you in detail what it is, but you can tell that I have a decent grasp of the subject because I have a fascination for this topic. As a student, I took the tests with the Bundeswehr to become an officer. But then I decided against committing myself. The military has always fascinated me. If I were a Russian citizen and a bit less smart but raised in Russia, maybe I would have volunteered as well. Then I would be one of those people you're not supposed to feel sorry for. Individual guilt deserves individual punishment. Absolutely. The Ukrainians should, and I sometimes wonder when I see what happens, for example, when the Ukrainians catch a spy who has given the Russians positions that probably caused dozens, maybe hundreds of deaths. I'm impressed that in Ukraine they still don't consider reintroducing the death penalty. So I can absolutely understand and support the punishment of individual guilt and so on. I can absolutely understand the context of war. In war, you have to defeat the enemy, and that includes eliminating them. Ideally, you do that by making them surrender, but if they refuse, of course you are allowed to use lethal force against them. But that doesn't mean that the people on the other side stop being human. And as I said, I've been connected to this topic for decades. For me, being a soldier was a kind of calling, but I didn't pursue it any longer than the time I spent in uniform. In another scenario with somewhat more positive outcomes during my own time in the Bundeswehr, where unfortunately I encountered a few non-commissioned officers and a few sergeants who really made my hair stand on end. And then there were a few other circumstances, my own immaturity at the time and so on, but in a different scenario I might have enlisted and become a soldier. That wouldn't be any different if I were a Ukrainian citizen or if I were a Russian citizen. And then as a Russian soldier, I would have marched into Ukraine on orders. If I were a 20-year-old Russian today, I probably would have been dumb enough to volunteer for this war. In the same way, as a Ukrainian, I would have volunteered in the first days of the war, or maybe in 2014, to then fight in eastern Ukraine. In another scenario, in another world. This shouldn't be misunderstood as me saying that I would be the volunteer who willingly goes to the front everywhere. That should be said by the one who actually did it. I don't want to claim from my desk chair that I would be the brave one, the one who wants to go to war for others, when I haven't actually done it. So please understand this as me speaking about hypothetical scenarios, that I am putting myself in the shoes of another person, someone I obviously am not, since I'm not currently in Ukraine. But from this perspective, I can understand why people go off to fight in this war. And maybe on top of everything, when it comes to interpersonal matters, I've always had a certain sense of sportsmanship. That might sound odd or even confusing when applied to war. But it has always bothered me when I watch speeches in the Bundestag, and even if something good is said, the applause is divided along party lines. If I were a member of parliament, I would applaud a good speech, even if it wasn't from my party or my coalition. If someone made a good joke, I would laugh, because I've always seen things in a sporting way. When I played soccer, when I played ice hockey, of course I congratulated the other teams on their good performances. That was always my understanding. That means I see competition that way, and I see it the same way in politics. That's why I'm always the one who emphasizes that, of course, you can believe that other people are wrong, but that doesn't make them bad people. Basically, I always try to understand the other side and to grant the other side certain things. And as for the war now, of course, war criminals belong in court. I have had to look at terrible crimes because I reported on castration, because I reported on beheading. And if I don't look at these things, if I don't verify for myself that a Ukrainian soldier was actually castrated alive, and that did happen. And unfortunately, I saw the video. If you expect me to feel sympathy for the perpetrator, you shouldn't. If I were a Ukrainian soldier, that perpetrator, if he were clearly identified, it would probably be better for him not to fall into my hands. But I distinguish between the individual and the collective, and I can understand why Russian soldiers, Russian citizens, make the decision to join the military. Among other reasons, because they have been socialized as Russians. That's also something you learn as a historian. You learn to judge things according to their time. I can't, from a German perspective, socialized in Germany, raised with German education and culture, simply project my worldview onto any random Russian and say that if he doesn't act the way I do, he's a bad person. Henrik Broder puts it nicely: resistance against the Nazis grows the longer they are gone. Because today everyone is in resistance against the Nazis. Yes, of course, because today people are socialized with the awareness of these crimes, with the understanding that discrimination can lead to such crimes. But the people back then grew up in a completely different world. And that's exactly how I see it with the Russians, of course. They are fellow human beings, and I know this upsets some people, but what upsets me is how people forget that, in the end, we are all human. That doesn't mean they can just be killed. They are soldiers, and soldiers can be fought against. But that's why, for example, it drives me absolutely mad when I see executions of prisoners, because I can accept that someone is killed in combat. I can accept that someone is seriously wounded in combat, but the moment someone has surrendered, they deserve to be treated properly. And that's the point where the outrage rises to a level that just isn't present in other situations. For me, that's a fundamental conviction, and I honestly have to say again and again that, to me, it's a complete brutalization of other people if they don't see it that way. I can only understand that as utter brutalization. We have these naval troops who have a shark as their mascot. Where does that come from? Because in the Red Sea, a Russian civilian was killed by a shark, a Russian tourist. It was then rumored that he had previously supported the war. By now, it's clear that it wasn't the same person. But even if he had, even if someone says, "I support the war," a civilian, in what kind of world does one celebrate the death of a civilian just because he is Russian? I refuse to take part in this brutalization. I am not a part of it, and I will continue to refuse to take part in it. And that's why, even though I know exactly how people in the Gaza Strip feel about the terrorist attack, even though I know that, even though I know how the civilians there celebrated it, I still feel compassion for them, because I have not forgotten my humanity despite the subject matter. And I hope that as many of my viewers as possible have not forgotten theirs either, because I have to say, this brutalization is unbearable for me. When I watch videos and see accounts that celebrate and find it funny how Russian soldiers who are seriously injured, oh, look, half his head gets blown off after another grenade drops. And they make fun of a Russian burning, that he is seriously injured and his uniform catches fire, and you can see the flames consuming his body while he is still moving. Things like that then generate jubilant and mocking comments on Twitter. People start saying things like Russian barbecue or something like that. I'm sorry, but that disgusts me. I support humanitarian causes. I have also donated money for weapons for Ukraine. I don't collect donations for weapons on this channel, but I personally have donated for weapons. because I wish the Ukrainians success in this war, and I have no illusions that it can be done with just ambulances. But I do not forget our humanity. And that's something that has accompanied me for a very, very long time in what I do politically. I can have the fiercest arguments with a political opponent, and afterwards I'll still go have a beer with them if they're willing to join me. I would applaud another politician, just as I would applaud a football club that scores a fantastic goal, or the opposing national team that scores an amazing goal. I can applaud them just the same and say, what an incredible goal. And one of my best friends, I was with her at a public viewing during the World Cup, I think, when Germany played against Poland. I don't know when it was, maybe 2006 or so. And everyone booed the Polish national anthem while she, as a Polish citizen, was standing next to me. And I was deeply ashamed of this behavior because I have always believed that you can fight over issues, but you must never completely lose respect for others. And I know that comparing a football match to war is a bold move. But the basic attitude remains the same, of course. I can understand why Russian soldiers sign up. It could also be out of a sense of adventure. But even if someone joins a war out of a sense of adventure, that doesn't make them inhuman. Because that's as old as humanity itself. Otherwise, we end up declaring all soldiers to be criminals, and all soldiers. We have misguided people in every nation. And not everyone who now signs up to fight on the Russian side does so with the intention of committing war crimes. Of course, there will be some who hope to commit sexual acts against women in Ukraine against their will. That will certainly happen as well. And those are criminals, and they deserve to be punished. And I can understand why, under martial law, some nations have retained the death penalty, even though they no longer have it in civilian criminal law. I think there are crimes that could justify the death penalty. For example, someone who has castrated another person alive. I would have absolutely no problem if that person is subsequently clearly identified. Ideally, if they even confess themselves, if they end up being hanged somewhere, I would have no problem with that. Absolutely not. That was absolutely horrific. I would have no problem if those identified, the prisoners of war who execute others, were to be executed themselves. I'm not a naive flower child. But I do recognize that just because someone fights for an evil cause, it doesn't mean they are individually evil. He can be fought individually, but the moment the fighting stops, he is a human being again. And that's why the laws of war exist. That's why there is the concept of ordre de combat. That's why there are rules for prisoners of war. The laws of war provide for all of this so that I do not punish people simply for fighting. War crimes, however, are not covered by this. The Geneva Convention protects prisoners of war, but it does not protect war criminals. And that's exactly how I see it as well. The Russian jus ad bellum is something different from jus in bello. The right to go to war is clear. Russia committed a wrong there because it started an illegal war. But that does not make everyone involved in this war a criminal. That is jus in bello, the law within war itself. That is a distinction according to international understanding, and it has to be, because otherwise there would be no reason to show any mercy at all. And if I no longer show mercy, then I won't receive any either. That means it is actually consistent in itself that I treat those from other nations who are waging war humanely, even if they are the aggressors. That even makes sense as an end in itself. So for me, it's because I can understand why Russian soldiers volunteer, because in another world, in a different scenario, as a similarly foolish Russian, I would have volunteered too. And I can relate to that since I have felt connected to this profession, this calling, for decades. That's also why I didn't dodge military service, even if it was only compulsory service, because I recognize that the law also protects the Russians as aggressors. That's precisely why, for me personally, and it profoundly disgusts me, this pervasive and utterly brutalizing general trend I observe across the vast expanse of the internet from countless individuals who, just 10 or so years ago, would most likely have proudly displayed stickers on their automobiles unequivocally stating, "Soldiers are murderers," and who now, with disturbing glee, openly celebrate when a Russian soldier tragically burns alive. For me, such footage is horrific. The footage that traumatized me, in addition to these most serious crimes, was of Russian soldiers taking their own lives, which is also being celebrated, with people making rankings of the funniest suicides of Russian soldiers. For me, these are terrible images to see. No, I'm sorry. And anyone who does that again, Honestly, anyone who takes pleasure in that should just disappear into their own corner of the internet, let themselves be celebrated there, and revel in the fact that people are dying in the most gruesome ways. I want nothing to do with them.